Okay, so good morning, everybody. We are going to actually begin chapter 9 today, but I do want to recap an idea which we learned very quickly at the end of chapter 8, which left everybody a little bit befuddled. Not befuddled, but I think that it's worth going over again just to really understand the concept and to be able to continue further. So therefore, we may or may not finish chapter 9 today. Hopefully, yes, but if not, we'll just overlap next week as well. Okay, so the concept that I want to just recap and go over again is the concept of the animal soul having an effect on the godly soul. In other words, what we were discussing in the previous chapters is the concept of klipas noiga meaning neutral activities, which can conceal godliness. Remember that the fact that they are called klipa means automatically that there is a concealment. Klipas noiga may not be a complete concealment, but it is a partial concealment, right? So therefore, any activities which fall into this category can be elevated or can descend into full-on klipa. In actual fact, as we mentioned last week, klipas noiga opens the door. If you don't have the correct intention, it opens the door for someone to act contrary to his nature, specifically a Jew to act contrary to his nature and to fall into actual sinning, which is really not within the Jew's nature, since his animal soul doesn't come from complete klipa, but comes from klipas noiga. The part that I wanted to reiterate and go over is the part of the effect. I see that Sina just joined. Hi, Sina. The effect of the animal soul on the godly soul, depending on which attributes are used. And in order to understand this, this chapter 9, is actually going to go further into the relationship between the animal and godly soul. In actual fact, we're going to start discussing today the battle between the souls. But before we get there, what's the effect? What can the effect be on the godly soul from the animal soul? And the answer that we gave last week, and this is what I want to repeat, is really it depends on which faculties of the animal soul are used. So for example, we know that each soul has 10 faculties or 10 attributes, the 10 spheres, right? So if you are involved in idle talk, dvarim b'telim in the Hebrew language, if you are involved in idle talk, which is really nothingness, it's permitted to talk, it's a permitted activity, unless, of course, you are wasting time from learning Torah, then it falls into a different category. But if you are involved in idle talk, that is not really affecting your intellect. In actual fact, the definition of idle talk is just idle. It's not very intelligent. So we don't use our intellect for this. It's affecting only the emotions of it's using the emotions of the animal soul, and therefore it affects the emotions of the godly soul. In other words, it correlates. If you use the emotions of the animal soul, you affect the emotions of the godly soul. And then if you use the intellect of the godly soul, you affect of the animal soul, you affect the intellect of the godly soul. But how does this actually occur practically? So the relation between the intellect and the emotions in the godly soul is that one affects the other. In actual fact, the intellect produces, as a result of studying in the understanding and internalizing, which is chachma, bina, and das, they in turn produce emotions of love and fear of Hashem, the most healthiest of emotions, right? However, there is a bridge that they have to pass. The intellect has to go over, has to affect the emotions. If one is involved, for example, in idle talk, which stems from the emotions of the animal soul, then the emotions of the godly soul are not fully affected by the intellect of the godly soul. So let me repeat that. If we are involved in emotionally affecting our animal soul. In other words, we're involved in activities stemming from the emotions of our animal soul, like idle talk, then the emotions of the godly soul cannot be fully effective, fully developed in their love and fear of Hashem. But then we spoke about getting involved in intellectual pursuits of the animal soul, which is studying, and we're not talking about prohibited subjects to study because that would enter the category of averos or sinning, but studying chachmas hagayim, in other words, just intellectual pursuits, studying of different subjects without intention for holiness, meaning you're just not studying with a purpose, like giving a parnasa to your family, or being able to understand a subject, a godly subject more, but you're studying without purpose. You are then using the intellect of your animal soul, and that in turn affects the intellect of the godly soul, preventing you from even having a full understanding of godly subjects. So not only would your emotions be affected, in other words, the intellect wouldn't affect the emotions, but to begin with, your intellect also wouldn't be affected as well. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that clear? Because that was something that we ended off last class, but we did it very quickly. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands, firstly, the correlation between intellect and emotions in a godly soul, that the intellect produces the emotions of love and fear of Hashem. And second of all, that you could actually affect the intellect and the emotions of the godly soul.
It's really cold in there.
Depending on which intellect.
I want to do this to figure out. I don't want to push. Just hear me. I don't.
That in turn, when we use our intellect and emotions of the animal soul, depending on what we use, it also affects the godly soul as well. And we said it in different ways. So either it affects the emotions that you can't fully love or fear Hashem, or it affects the intellect, which means that you can't even start understanding godly subjects. Okay, is there any question on that before we move on to chapter 9? Okay, so I am going to move on to chapter 9. If you still have questions at the end, you could ask that as well. This chapter begins speaking about the battle between the two souls, which is effectively when a person feels conflicted. Why does a person feel conflicted? Because you're not acting in alignment with your values. That's the buzzwords of today, to act in alignment with your values. However, what exactly does that mean according to Torah? So firstly, we have to understand that each soul has its own way of functioning, and each soul has its own location and faculties in the body. So let's understand this. Biologically speaking, your heart pumps blood to the rest of the body, correct? In other words, your heart influences your body by spreading blood throughout the body. The brain influences the body, not by pumping out blood, but by sending signals to the rest of the body. Okay. In other words, the brain is more distant from the actual flesh of the body. It sends signals, but it's not actually in the body. It's in, but governs the whole body. Now, let's understand that, how it pertains to the godly soul, the nefesh halikis, and the animal soul, the nefesh habahamis. The main location, oops, 1 second. I don't know why that's coming up. Okay. The main location of the animal soul is in the heart. Not just anywhere in the heart, but in the left ventricle of the heart, the Alter Rebbe tells us. Now, what's interesting is that we know that when we feel emotions, and emotions are based in the heart, we actually feel our emotions throughout our body, just like the heart pumps blood throughout the whole body. So emotions like anger, desire, pride are felt throughout the body. It's not just like, oh, I'm feeling anger. Oh, I'm feeling whatever emotion I'm feeling. I'm feeling jealousy, or I'm feeling whatever it is. It actually is felt. It's a physical sensation throughout our body, much like our physical heart spreads blood to the body. Our nefesh habahamis is primarily seated in the heart, so it's primarily emotional, affecting the whole body, and it ascends to the brain. And actually, if you look at the body, the heart is below the brain. So if you start off with the emotions and you want to have a brain emotion connection, so if you start off with the emotions rise to the brain. There is a correlation, there is a connection between the brain, the intellect, and the emotions in the nefesh habahamis, but the correlation and the connection is different to the divine soul. We're going to get there in a minute. What is the correlation between the emotions and the intellect in the animal soul? The brain reacts to the heart, right? So have you ever heard people using the term being reactive? That's because the person is behaving, his behavior is stemming from the animal soul, and his brain is reacting to the animal soul by either justifying the emotion, like I should feel angry, right? Because, she did whatever, and she feels whatever, right? Or he did whatever. So the brain thereafter justifies the emotion. That's one way of relating to it. And another way of relating to the emotions of the heart, how does the intellect relate, is that it actually may restrict the emotions as a way of self-preservation. In other words, if you are an adult, if you're a 2-year-old, let's start with a 2-year-old first. If you're a 2-year-old and you feel an emotion such as jealousy very strongly, you're going to throw a tantrum. As you grow older, you're still going to feel those emotions pretty strongly, but your brain kicks in and tells you, 1 second, this is not appropriate behavior for an adult. So even though you feel really angry, the brain hopefully will restrict the emotion to protect you. And it's a selfishness. It's not that you are transforming the emotion. It's not that you will feel differently. You're feeling differently, but you just don't want to be looked at as an idiot. So therefore, your brain will protect you, will preserve you, is selfish in connection with the emotions of the nefesh habahamis, and will kind of like restrain you in a certain way, in an age-appropriate way, let's say. So those are two ways that the brain correlates to the emotions in the animal soul. The brain either justifies the emotion or restricts the emotion in a way of self-preservation. The godly soul, however's main location is in the intellect. We mentioned before that in the body, the brain is not so connected to the flesh of the body, it sends signals to the body, right? So the main seat of the godly soul is in the brain, but it also affects the heart. It also affects the heart, much as we learned previously, that it affects the heart in the way of producing the emotions of love and fear of Hashem, producing healthy emotions. As a result of using your chachma, bina, and das, not just one faculty, because then it's not lasting. If you want to produce lasting emotions and not fleeting emotions, then you have to be able to learn the subject matter, reflect on the subject matter, and internalize the subject matter, which is in turn chachma, bina, and das. And then those emotions become enduring. Now, the question is, in this chapter, the Alter Rebbe begins the question, why can't these two souls coexist in peace? Why can't they live together in peace and harmony? So the answer is that each soul, truthfully, is like a king who wants complete dominance, sovereignty over the entire body, which is compared to a small city. So you can't have two kings ruling over a city. Each king wants to rule over the inhabitants of this city, which is the body, without force, wants to rule over the inhabitants willingly, that the inhabitants should submit to the will of the king willingly. No one's being forced. No one's being forced to listen to your nefesh habahamis, right? That's an interesting, sometimes our limiting beliefs tell us that that's my nature. I can't change really. That you're saying you're being forced? No, you're not being forced. Neither the animal soul or the godly soul wants to rule by force. And the Alter Rebbe in this chapter goes more into the way the godly, divine soul wants to influence the body. So just before we go into the way it does it, how do we know that each one wants to dominate the other? So we know that when we say Shema, we say the prayer of Shema Yisrael, and then we say Baruch Shem, and then we say V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha. You should love Hashem with all your heart. Now, in Hebrew, the word my heart is libi, my heart. Your heart is libecha, your heart. But levavcha is not really a word. So the commentaries explain that the reason why there are two vases in this instance is referring to shnei yitzarecha, to your two inclinations, your yetzer hara and your yetzer tov, which each one comes either from the divine soul, the yetzer tov, and the yetzer hara comes from the animal soul. So each one wants complete dominance over the other, but the ideal, as we're told in this prayer of V'ahavta, is to actually, for the divine soul to dominate the animal soul. That's what we're striving towards. That's how we're learning Tanya. That's what the Beinoni is, that the animal, the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul, will eventually dominate the animal soul. And how so? So what's interesting is that the Alter Rebbe describes the way that the divine soul wants to dominate the animal soul. And he gives three stages, and I'd actually like to read it to you. I'm going to read it to you from the translation of Lessons in Tanya. So I'm going to read it in English as well so that everyone can understand. The divine soul's will and desire is that she alone rule over the person and direct him, so that all the organs be subject to her discipline. So firstly, the divine soul wants the person to obey. In other words, to listen to my commands like a king, right? Furthermore, that they surrender themselves completely to her. So the second stage after obedience is surrender. In other words, when you surrender your will to another's, that means that you still have a will. You want something different, but you're putting it aside for the will of the other. So the divine soul wants the body to firstly obey. Second of all, not obey kicking and screaming, but surrender your will to the divine soul. So which means that you still want something else, but you're surrendering your will, right? And these are the stages that people advance in Avodas Hashem, really. And the third stage, the third and complete stage, which tzaddikim attain, is that they not, as that she desires further still that all the organs become a chariot for her. Now, in the olden days, they used the chariot to travel from place to place. Nowadays, we use cars and planes and trains and buses and whatever it is, right? But the point is to be a vehicle to Hashem's will. How do we become a vehicle? The patriarchs, the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, were called Merkaves, vehicles, chariots to God's will. What does that mean? A car does not have a will of its own. A car has no agenda. A car goes where the driver drives it, right? So at this stage of transformation, at this stage of sovereignty over the body. The divine soul has reached a stage where it has transformed the animal soul to such an extent that the animal soul at this point has no will of its own, has no agenda, is not submitting its will. It's just in complete harmony with the will of Hashem, which is the ideal and which is accomplished by tzaddikim, not by Beinonim. However, we do learn something from this level, which is why the Alter Rebbe brings this level to our attention of being in complete harmony with the will of Hashem. We, however, are at the level of A, obedience, the body obeying the divine soul, Hashem's will, and B, the possibility of submitting our will to the will of Hashem or the divine soul. Okay, so now how does that happen? By the way, just going back to the complete transformation of the animal soul, where the animal soul is in complete harmony with the will of Hashem, that, Tanya tells us, is actually the healthiest body-soul connection, where the body has no agenda of its own, is in complete harmony with the will of Hashem, and that, in other words, is known as complete bittul, complete nullification. It's not submission, it's nullification. There's no agenda, no plan. It's complete harmony and complete doing the will of Hashem. Now, how does the divine soul want to accomplish this? Okay, so going back to the battle, right? So in order to understand this battle, we have to understand a little bit more the nature of the animal soul. The nature of the animal soul is to feel pleasure. That's actually its nature and its talent. That's its default state. The animal soul loves being in its cozy comfort zone under the covers. The animal soul will do everything to preserve itself, to not work too hard, to not have to stretch its limits, to not feel uncomfortable, and to pursue pleasure. Pursue pleasure, either the pleasure of your own body or the pleasures of the world, to partake in of the pleasures of the world, which actually are one and the same eventually. So like lust comes from the animal soul, for example. Anything that comes easily, anything that comes easily. When the intellect of the divine soul, okay, remember that we're studying Torah for the purpose of producing the emotions and of transforming the animal soul, dominating the animal soul, as in a city, ruling over the animal soul. When the intellect of the divine soul produces emotions, it produces them in the right side of the heart. Now, remember we said that this main seat of the animal soul is in the left ventricle of the heart. But there is a correlation between the intellect and the emotions, both in the divine soul and the animal soul. So when the divine soul produces emotions, those emotions express themselves in the right ventricle of the heart. And what happens is it causes a love of Hashem, a very great, fiery love of Hashem in the right ventricle of the heart. But that love of Hashem can become so great that it spills over into the left ventricle. It like overflows. You can develop a love of Hashem so great that what happens when it overflows is that is how it influences and transforms the animal soul. So in other words, it takes the negative traits in the animal soul and transforms it to positive traits. In other words, pursuit of pleasure of the world now becomes love of Hashem and pursuit of godly pleasures like learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. So it all really begins by studying and using your nefesh elokis to understand Hashem, to understand godly matters, produce this amazing love, which then overflows into the left ventricle of the heart and produces and transforms it in actual fact. Instead of pursuing worldly pleasures or bodily pleasures, it now has a geschmack, it now wants to pursue learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. So in actual fact, when you're studying Torah and you're enjoying a class and you're enjoying a good vart, it's not your godly soul necessarily, you're actually influencing your animal soul. It's your animal soul which is enjoying it, which is the which is the goal, actually, to transform it, right? So godly pleasure, what is godly pleasure? It's the study, the experiencing the pleasure of knowledge of Hashem, each person according to his level and capacity. Each person could be different, and it's according to their level. And what's actually interesting is that since the main characteristic of the animal soul is feeling pleasure, and the godly soul is to feel to be intellectual. Intellectual people are not usually like fiery and bubbly people, right? But since the talent or the characteristic of the animal soul is to feel pleasure, when you've transformed your animal soul to feel pleasure in godly pursuits, it's actually your neshama has reached a higher level than if you were just learning with your godly soul or just doing mitzvahs just as a result of your godly soul. Because you're attaching the talent or the characteristic of the animal soul to Hashem, to the will of Hashem. So it's elevating it even higher than itself. And remember that the animal soul comes from klipas noiga. Yes, there is godliness in it, but it's concealed. So when we take away that garment, when we take away that concealment by influencing the emotions of, firstly, the heart, the right side of the heart, and overflowing to the left side of the heart, we're taking away those garments, then we elevate our nefesh habahamis to kedusha. So in other words, instead of now having a love of self or a love of the world, you're now able to have a real love of Hashem because you're using also your animal soul. In other words, to love Hashem with your godly soul is not enough. Your godly soul automatically loves Hashem. The goal over here is to actually influence your animal soul to love Hashem as well. And love of Hashem, this chapter concludes, actually comes in stages, which is not so applicable to us, but it's just interesting to know about. It starts off as this fiery love. Tanya calls it ava karish be'esh, a fiery, flaming love. A fire always wants to go higher. So this love is always wanting to grow bigger and bigger and wanting to love Hashem more, but it's full of enthusiasm and full of fire. It's a thirst almost. And that's how it affects the emotions. That's what we're capable of. The love of tzaddikim actually is compared to a love that's compared to water. When you're like very thirsty and you're thirsting for the water and you really need a drink, but you don't have that drink. So you're like really looking for that drink. When you finally get that glass of water, now you're calm. You're satiated. So you've reached the stream. Now you could relax. And that's when the love of Hashem becomes complete. It's like a love of water. It's calm. It's complete pleasure and godly, because pleasure comes from the element of water, actually. So when you've arrived at the destination, you're calm like water. It's a complete transformation, enjoyment, pleasure in the pursuits of Hashem, studying Torah, doing mitzvahs, which is the life of a tzaddik, actually. In other words, so what's the bottom line of this parak? Hashem gave us the capacity to feel pleasure. Very often, this capacity gets in our way, comes from the animal soul. The goal is to channel the pursuit of pleasure into serving Hashem, into the study of Torah, the doing of mitzvahs, in channeling your emotions correctly for the intention of serving Hashem. In other words, you have to replace the pleasures that you feel for this world and the desire for pleasures for a desire for godliness and a pleasure in godly pursuits. You can't just take away the pleasure. It's not like you can get into the car and close the window. I once heard an interesting mashal, just to finish, that ahava v'yira is an acronym for avir, which is air. Right? So if you go into the car, if you want to be a vehicle for godliness, it's not enough just to close the windows and think that you're not going to feel the heat outside. You have to turn on the avir, the air conditioning, to be able to arrive at the place that you're wanting to arrive. So you actually have to replace it with a pleasure for godly pursuits and not just leave it empty. So it's not enough just to sur meira, run away from what's not good. You actually have to, the ideal and the point of what this parak of Tanya is starting to explain to us about the battle of the souls is that you can't just avoid the battle. You have to win the battle. You have to actually transform. You have to replace the pursuit of pleasure and staying in your comfort zone with a different comfort zone, a godly comfort zone and godly pleasures. Any questions? If you have a question, you should unmute yourself because I muted everybody.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm trying to coordinate, Tanya, with psychology, and the more up-to-date way is that emotions are held in our neurological system, which goes throughout our body as opposed to just the heart. So how do I like understand that from the lens of
Well,
Tanya?
the heart affects the whole body. That's exactly what this parak is saying. Very much as the heart affects the whole body, what this parak is saying is the heart is the seat of the emotions. You may feel the emotions throughout your body. It affects your whole body.
Mm-hmm.
When you're angry, you feel that emotion with your whole body. Correct? But the seat is in the heart. It starts in the heart. Does that make sense?
I'm not trying to challenge you, and I really want to put it together, but it's like, because the nervous system is from the brain and it goes throughout the body. So, and the nervous system is the fine detector of like reactions and
okay. So first of all,
like
okay.
that.
So first of all, let's just clear something up. You're not challenging me. It's the Alter Rebbe. I'm merely giving over, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Secondly, it's like this. What we do find today, and I've had many discussions with people on this group, including Panina and other people. We do find many correlations of modern day psychology and neurological systems to what is written in Tanya. However, what we do have to be careful about is that we're not trying to correlate Tanya to modern day psychology, but we can find aspects of modern day psychology within Tanya. I don't know if you're clear with that. So not 100% that everything we hear about in modern day psychology is according to Torah. Not necessarily. Now, I am not a psychologist, so I am not an expert. But what the Alter Rebbe is explaining here is basically two maybe nervous systems which are trying to dominate the body. So one is healthy and one is unhealthy. But when we call healthy and when we say healthy and unhealthy, we're talking in terms of how Torah defines healthy and unhealthy, not necessarily what other modalities may term as healthy or unhealthy. Correct? So whereas I cannot explain to you how the nervous system works, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, right? What we do learn in Tanya, and once I was going to do it today, but I didn't have enough time. I once actually Googled like the left ventricle, the right ventricle. There are like correlations. So I should Google it again, actually, and bring it to you. I could bring it to you next time if I find it again. But this is how Alter Rebbe describes it, that both the animal soul and the divine soul both use the intellect and both use the emotions and both are affected. They're intertwined. However, they shouldn't be intertwined. The ideal is for the divine nervous system, let's call it that, to dominate the animal nervous system.
Can you just repeat what you just said? I want to the last part that you just said.
The Alter Rebbe explains how there are two systems fighting over for dominance, really, right? So the ideal, what's the ideal? Why are we learning Tanya? The ideal is for the godly soul to dominate the animal soul, right? That's how we grow. That's how we have healthy emotions. That's how we serve Hashem. a tzaddik has completely transformed his animal soul, his animal nervous system, word to be, or you could call it that, to be in complete harmony with the will of Hashem, right? But as we are potential Beinanis, we are conflicted, right? The battle of the two souls is the source of conflict in a person. We are conflicted human beings. Okay, we are potential Beinanis. We may have Beinani moments, and we can have them more and more and more and more until we become complete Beinanis, right? Till we actually dominate, subjugate our animal soul completely. But the ideal is for the divine nervous system to dominate the animalistic nervous system. And how does the divine nervous system operate? Starting with the intellect and producing emotions instead of using your intellect to justify emotions. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Could I ask you a question just so I want to clarify what you
Sure,
said?
Mindy. Yeah.
You said, so when we learn Torah and we have like pleasure from that, that's coming from our animal soul. Did I get that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, but that's good.
Okay.
That's not a bad
Okay.
thing. Our animal soul is
Right.
not
No,
inherently
that's the
bad.
goal.
Right. That's the
No, that's
goal.
the goal.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. I didn't like realize that. Like I thought, oh,
It's,
that's
it's
from the
actually
godly
both.
soul.
You're actually feeling pleasure from both your animal soul and your godly soul, but your animal soul is better at feeling pleasure than your godly soul is. Because it's
more in the
more
brain and in the heart,
egoistic.
right?
Yeah, and it's more egoistic. It like wants what's good for it, you know?
Okay. Got it. So so our goal is to use all our pleasures as much like towards for godly purposes. That is the
Exactly.
goal.
Exactly. To channel. Exactly. Channel pleasure for godly pursuits.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else before we sign off?